Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you've had a moment to recharge with some lunch and engage into our current exhibitions. Thank you once again to Shannon Stratton and Barbara Perisky for leading the tours this afternoon. And I also learned that another member of our curatorial team, Angelique Vizcarrondo-Lavoie, led the tour of Tanya Agnita's solo show, so special thanks to her as well. Now, the chair of our next session is Namita Gupta-Wiggers. Namita is a curator, educator, and writer based in Portland, Oregon, and she's also the director of the Masters of Arts and Craft Studies at Warren Wilson College in North Carolina, a new low residency program focused on craft history and theory. So I'm just going to immediately turn it over to Namita. Come on, why don't you come on up?
This is pretty much my life, moving microphones down. Before we begin, I wanted to, Lisa and I wanted to share a poem just to sort of set the tone for the conversation, and we really do want it to be conversational after we share our work. And this is a poem that Nicholas Galanin just posted today. And imagine that you were born from the womb of the earth to be bathed in the warmth of your Father's presence. Imagine that you have been guided by the creatures around you who had already created an order to the world. Imagine that the stars are a map to your ancestors, and the wind has marked the swirl of your fingertips to acknowledge your life. Imagine that you are now responsible for caring for your ailing mother. Imagine that you can see the creatures who cared for you and taught you suffering as you transit by them daily. Imagine that you are responsible for being part of this world. How would you change the choices you make today? This is a poem by Heather Attal. I'm going to introduce Lisa Weinbaum, who is a collaborator with me and Aaron Hansa-Fuentes on the Unsettling Coloniality bibliography, which all of you can access through Critical Craft Forum. Lisa Weinbaum is an associate professor of fiber and material studies and affiliated full-time faculty in art history, theory, and criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. They hold a PhD from Goldsmiths, University of London, and Dr. Weinbaum is working on a book titled Social Fabrics, The Art of Community, with support from the Craft Research Fund. Please welcome Lisa.
Okay, thank you, Namita, and thank you so much to the organizers for this really important symposium. Our conversations today and over the past few days have been taking place on the ancestral lands of the Algonquin peoples, and I'm an uninvited guest on their territories. In the context of this session on unsettling coloniality, the word ground is inscribed with histories of conquest and theft, while shared ground provides an opportunity, among other things, to reinscribe histories that require greater attention, as in so many of the presentations so far. So I'm a scholar of contemporary fiber, and I work at the intersections of textiles and politics, drawing heavily on disciplines outside the field in an effort to explore themes that are often relegated to the margins of mainstream scholarship in fiber. And I'll begin with 3 questions. So the first is, what are some of the ways that textiles were remade by colonial violences and economic imperatives that originated in Europe? How do these histories bear on our understandings of contemporary fiber and the textile crafts? And are these connections being adequately theorized in the fields of fiber and critical craft? So I'll briefly consider these questions using specific examples from the Americas and Asia, as explored mainly by scholars writing from decolonial and intersectional perspectives. Indigenous and decolonial scholars like Eve Tuck, Jody A. Bird, Lorenzo Versini, and Patrick Wolf observe that unlike prior forms of conquest and empire, the European colonial project was unique in its scope and duration, impacting every region of the world. Here we can see that almost every country in the world, except for 5 in orange, was put under total or partial European control. Colonization established new and unprecedented forms of resource exploitation, profit, and wealth. But Europeans also introduced racial hierarchies to the mechanisms of conquest, resulting in new racialized forms of extermination and exploitation. Lands, resources, and human labor were transformed into commodities and mobilized to enrich European men. Scholars Walter Mignolo and J. Mufwad-Paul assert that colonialism provided the resources for industrialization and also prepared the world for global capitalism. Textiles, textile crafts, played a substantial role in the imposition of new capitalist markets, as textile societies and structures across altered to align with European proto-capitalist trade and commodity systems. Historians Karen A. Grobart and Ana Maria Cresta, together with sociologist Margaret A. Villanueva, provide detailed analyses of how Spanish colonists reconfigured highly advanced indigenous modes of textile production in the Inca and Aztec empires, now Peru and Mexico. There, colonizers encountered highly sophisticated achievements in weaving and dyeing, embroidery, feather cloths, woven cloth, and garments. Colonists transformed indigenous textile systems in order to maximize profits, introducing proto-industrial systems of mass production like speed and standardization. They replaced indigenous backstrap, ground stake, and horizontal looms with much larger European upright and foot treadle looms, better suited to commercial and export production. Queer and transgender theorists Scott Loria Morganson and Leslie Feinberg remind us that across the colonized world, Europeans destroyed non-hierarchical and matrilineal societies, imposing heteronormative gender binaries and divisions of labor. In Peru and Mexico, as in other parts of the colonized world, Europeans feminized textile work as women's domestic labor. And they radically reconfigured, and they feminized textile work as women's domestic labor, and radically reconfigured indigenous systems of textile work. They introduced highly demanding forms of textile tribute, and as a result, indigenous women suffered great pressure to produce cloth to Spanish specifications. Spanish overlords forced them to work faster, continuously, and more physically, often under conditions of violent coercion. As Villanueva observes, indigenous women's low-waged or unpaid textile work subsidized the capital accumulation of Spanish colonizers. The Indian subcontinent provides another example of reconfiguration and assimilation. In an effort to grow its fledgling textile industry during the Industrial Revolution, Britain imposed prohibitive tariffs on Indian cloth to stymie its import into Britain. Colonists simultaneously flooded the Indian market with lower quality textiles manufactured in England, with devastating consequences for India's cotton industry, and I believe this has been widely studied and probably known in this room. All the while, raw Indian cotton was exported en masse to feed the textile mills in the north of England. Colonial plunder brought materials like precious metals, woods, dyestuffs, textiles, and porcelain back to Europe, along with ways of making, knowledges, and expertise. And craft production in Europe was advanced and augmented substantially as a result. textiles have always been one of the most heavily traded commodities in the world. Trade records show that textiles comprised an integral part of pre-colonial regional trade systems in the Americas and also between Asia, Africa, and Western Europe. With the advent of long-distance travel by sea in the 15th century, Europeans were able to travel and conquer the waterways that connected existing local and regional trade systems. Trade in textiles changed dramatically as Europeans seized control of raw materials like silk, cotton, wool, flax, and indigo, together with the routes along which they were traded. Colonization also brought unprecedented numbers of enslaved and indentured workers under European control. The ships that carried raw materials and finished goods between Europe and its colonies transported enslaved Africans and later indentured workers from China and the Indian subcontinent. So you can see the overlap of these groups. Scholars William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, Jean M. West, Lisa Lowe, and Karen Hampton assert that the Industrial Revolution, which began in textiles, could not have happened if not for the assets provided by chattel slavery. For Lowe, chattel slavery in the United States made possible the entire global textile industry, and it played an indispensable role in forging global industrial capitalism. So, should we reconsider craft's relationships to industrialization in light of these histories? What if I said that craft emerged in relation to colonization and not only industrialization? These relations are incredibly complex, but I suggest that colonization impacted craft in ways that have yet to be fully theorized. Textiles also serve to symbolically uphold narratives of colonial power, possession, and control, as in two examples from Asia during the 19th century. This was a time of changing colonial mechanisms, like the imposition of direct British rule on the Indian subcontinent and coerced trade relations between China and the West. Until the mid-19th century, China had strict regulations to protect its market from the import of Western industrially produced goods. But with its defeat in the Opium Wars, China was forced to sign treaties granting Britain, France, Russia, and the United States ever-increasing access to its markets. Fashion historian Sarah Chang notes that while China was never formally colonized, coerced trade relations produced a type of semi- or pseudo-colonialism. Following the Opium Wars, woven and embroidered silk textiles from China were increasingly available in Britain, where they were displayed in British homes as symbols of wealth and domination. Possession of embroidered Chinese textiles produced a conception of China as a place of exotic and traditional ceremony made available to the British consumer. For Chang, the collection, display, and appropriation of Chinese textiles into Western domestic forms like the ones here was imbued with Orientalism and racism. Post-colonial scholar Paul Sherrod details the destruction of Kashmiri's shawl production during the transition to direct British rule on the Indian subcontinent. He provides a case study of 4 woven and embroidered Kashmiri map shawls, this is one of them, commissioned for the court of Maharaja Ranbir Singh. The map shawls use multiple perspective Mughal painting conventions to depict maps of Srinagar and Kashmir Valley. Produced during the colonial survey of Kashmir by British colonial geographers, one may read the shawls as a counter-assertion of rights of surveillance and ownership. During the imposition of direct British rule, colonists appropriated these Mughal textiles and others as symbols of British possession, while simultaneously reconfiguring Kashmiri shawl production to suit the tastes of European consumers. British rulers imposed export-oriented systems of mass production, and they replaced skilled male embroiderers with low-waged female piece workers. Displayed in European palaces, museums, and homes, textiles spoke of the power of empire to possess all kinds of things from all over the world. We can also ask whether contemporary textile displays might continue to invoke ideals of empire. Sociologist Virinder S. Kalra observes that textiles are implicated in a history of colonialism and imperialism, which brings together disparate parts of the world in a complex web of relations at the political, economic, and social levels. But as we know, of course, the textile crafts are not a thing of the past. Despite attempts at erasure and assimilation, textile producers, techniques, and processes survive and continue to thrive. Textiles played and continue to play a central role in decolonial struggles and also nation-building projects. This paper and the accompanying visuals are taken from lectures from my class, Contemporary Histories Fiber, which I teach at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. The class moves back and forth across time and space to examine fiber in close relation to world histories, politics, and cultural production. Emphasis is on thinking critically about the ways in which history is constructed and on frameworks of plurality and multiplicity. There can be no single account of fiber history, nor any other history for that matter. So instead, I emphasize histories, modernisms, crafts, knowledges, domesticities, genders, labors, and communities. And I'm going to quickly show some visuals from the class. Critiques of colonialism, structural violence, Eurocentrism, and capitalism underpin our discussions in the class, which seek to unsettle dominant paradigms in fiber and textile history and scholarship. We interrogate how key themes in fiber, like art-craft hierarchies, gender, the domestic, abstraction, and women's work, have been largely theorized from Eurocentric and white-dominant perspectives, often without enough regard for race, class, sexuality, and geography. Lectures and assigned readings rely heavily on scholarship in Indigenous studies, decolonial studies, critical race studies, civilization studies, literary theory, sociology, and labor histories. On the one hand, this points to promising possibilities for cross-pollination with scholarship in fiber and critical craft. On the other hand, it reveals a lack of attention to colonialism and race in much canonical scholarship on contemporary fiber and craft. By canonical scholarship, I mean a larger body of published, widely cited scholarship that serves to theorize, historicize, and delineate a given field of practice. In fiber, over 90% of this literature is authored by English-speaking, white, heteronormative scholars, most of whom are based in the United States, Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Over the course of my BFA in fiber and an MA in textiles, I was taught nothing of the histories that I attempted to survey today. Scholarship and teaching in fiber and the textile crafts remain incomplete without attention to the structural violences that are inextricably connected to textiles. Such scholarship, authored primarily by scholars and curators of color, is readily available, and here are some of their names. Their works must not be marginalized from the fiber canon. Settler colonialism and colonialism are not things of the past. They are ongoing structures of racial, gender, and economic differentiation and domination. Unsettling or decolonization requires us to challenge dominant paradigms and canons, and the burden cannot fall disproportionately on those who were marginalized in the first place. Those who benefit from the ongoing structures of colonialism, notably those with white privilege or advantage like myself, must share the labor of what artist and writer Maya Macrandalal calls diversis, not only fostering diversity, but moving past diversity to dismantle oppressive structures and systems of exclusion that often prevent it. So this decolonial bibliography, which, as Namita mentioned, is available on the Critical Craft Forum website, was compiled by Namita Gupta-Wiggers, Aram Hansi-Fuentes, and myself in response to the elisions and omissions surveyed here, and that we also encountered. This project is also an example of cross-disciplinary investigation, collaboration, and sharing. So I'll just close with two questions, and we can return to any of these later. What can we do to unsettle dominant paradigms and pedagogies in fiber and craft? What are some strategies for dialogue and for sharing resources with a view to expanding and strengthening scholarship and pedagogy in fiber and critical craft? Thank you. So before Namita gives her presentation, I just want to present the bio of Aram Hansi-Fuentes, who can't be here with us. She's presenting a keynote for the Four Freedoms project at the same time. Aram Hansi-Fuentes is a fiber, social practice, and performance artist who works to claim spaces for immigrant and disenfranchised communities. Her work often revolves around skill sharing, specifically sewing techniques, to create multi-ethnic and intergenerational sewing circles, which become a place for empowerment, subversion, and protest. Aram is currently artist in residence at the Pulitzer Art Foundation and a sponsored artist at High Concept Labs in Chicago. She's a 2016 Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow, a 2016 3A Arts Awardee, and a 2017 Sustainable Arts Foundation Awardee. She earned her BA in Art and Latin American Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and her MFA in Fiber and Material Studies from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she's an assistant adjunct professor, and you can find her work online. I suggest you look at it.
Tell you how many conferences I've been at where I've said, if someone will design a podium that goes up and down, I will make sure it gets a lot of play. So what I'm going to do today is talk with you a little bit about some things that I have not talked about in public in this way, and things that make me a little bit uncomfortable as a way of framing how I'm structuring a new program. I will also tell you that this program is brand new, as in we just had the very first residency this past July. So much like Hideo this morning, or earlier today, I am at the point where I can tell you a narrative, but I can't give you a whole lot of analysis yet. So instead, what I'm hoping is by sharing with you what we're doing, that you all will also open up, that it will open up a space for us to have conversations about what you're doing, so that there are ways that we can help build a craftscape that is going to really serve the field and join some of the other stellar programs that are out there. Before I continue though, I do want to say a quick thank you to Elisa and to Catherine and to Marilyn for the incredible conference that has come together here, and it was a privilege to be a part of the working group, and I really appreciate it. And the discussions that we had in the working group played a big role in informing some of the things that I'm going to share with you today, but then also sharing some of the things that I'm doing in the program itself. So definitely a connection here. I put this in pink because pink is hard to read on the screen. I love pink on the screen, but I know it can be challenging. And I wanted to just mention that this is personal. This question about unsettling coloniality is personal, and the reason is because I am a brown body in a white context. My being here disrupts the boundaries of ideas of the West, modernity, or what it means to be American. Who does this include? Does it include those who are born and raised and educated and employed in the West, so-called West? Does modernity include those who gave resources, labor, and cultural legacies for other nations to maintain power, surpass them in power, and continue to hold this power? What does American mean? Who does American mean? And these are some of the questions that go through my mind as I prepare curriculum, as I talk to my students, as I prepare the talk for today. I am an American. When you say American, do I come up in your vision? Am I part of this? There's only 2 of us who are South Asian in origin who are here at this conference today. If there's a third one, let me know, because I didn't see you. And this raises questions about what is appropriation too. Is it appropriation if I had chosen to be a medievalist and study European medieval art? These are questions that also go through my mind that are about flipping these questions of appropriation and coloniality. So I want to share with you some things that happened in my life, because I think that there are some personal stories that don't get shared, they get shared privately. And I think it's important to understand, as someone who has been asked not too far in the past, if I really thought of myself as a person of color. Last time I checked in the mirror, yes. These are some of the kinds of experiences that happened in 1993 after I had worked at the Blackford Gallery in Houston for a number of years, for 3 years. I was running an education program, and on the left you'll see the exhibitions that I was interested in that were going on around at that time. Exhibitions that were pushing back on the culture wars, changing the way we were thinking about who was part of the conversation in art history. And some of the students like Michael Ray Charles and James Nakagawa, who were part of, who are teaching now and are part of a real change that happened during that time period of including other kinds of voices in art history itself. These are some of the things that were said in meetings at which I was present. People only do these multicultural programs to get funding. How are we supposed to talk critically about this work? Take fried chicken and watermelon to that ethnic potluck. When I raised this issue with my boss, I was told that I was very sensitive and that I wasn't being culturally sensitive to the person who made that racist remark. So what are the next steps when you're working in a contemporary art museum and these are the kinds of experiences you're having, in addition to a number of really fantastic experiences too, admittedly. So please know that these were not everyday kinds of things, but they were significant enough that I felt that you should know that they happen. They are true. But decided the next steps were to enroll in graduate school. So I went to the University of Chicago. There was a man named Paul Rogers who was there, who was working on race theory and doing it through art history. And at the time, my husband did not want to live in New York City, and Chicago was a great option. And I arrived at graduate school, having taken 4 years to work in museums, and discovered that there was this person named Derrida and Foucault, these people who everyone was quoting, and I had no idea who they were, no idea. And everyone had to have a Foucault or Derrida quote in the first footnote of their paper. So, I thought I was going to fail out of school because I had a lot of catching up to do. And as I was trying desperately to catch up, and I will say that I gave myself carpal tunnel, rewriting things so that I could understand theory. It was a very physical process of getting into the construction of language. These are the books that caught my attention. These are the books that I was interested in reading. I began working with Arjuna Potterai as his research assistant, and then also worked for both him and Carol Breckenridge. I also was working with Homi Bhabha. He ruined my writing for a long time, as I said the other day, and part of why I'm presenting this to you in a more conversational way is because I really want to resist that, for me, I want to resist that kind of presentational structure that we set forth as the way that we do things. But these are the books that I was reading and that I was participating in. And as you can tell, they're not art history. So with that, the kinds of questions that I started having about art history set me up in some ways to be sort of a bad art historian. When I was facing a history of photography class, I asked about the introduction in non-Western settings and was told there's no evidence, there's nothing. And I found a book in Bengali that actually documents the early years of the history of photography, wrote my paper on the introduction of photography in India, and for the record, Photography Society in Calcutta was founded the year before the one in London. But there's no history out there, right? There's no information. So, and you can see with the film example, there were other examples. My master's thesis was looking at, was titled Reifying Ideology Representations of Chinese in 19th Century American Art, which meant that I was looking at Frederick Remington and Charles Marion Russell. Well, in 1993, that was not exactly considered appropriate art to be looking at in an art history program. And these are some of the challenges. When your questions are different and the material you want to cover is different in a lot of contexts, how many times do we say, no, you can't study that, or no, it's not appropriate? It's much better now, and I think the presentations we've had all weekend really reveal that. But these are some of the things that have gone on, and some of our peers and our colleagues who are teaching experience some of these things, and it's the reason they study what they do. I was also interested in the American Family Home course, and this actually was what my proposed dissertation and approved dissertation was going to be about. I was questioning the whole, deconstructing the whole idea of the American family home. And this is where craft came in for me. Because you walk into an immigrant family's home, and there is a textile. There is something made of wood, there is something made of leather, there is something that is ceramic. There's also photo albums, but that's a whole other story. But there are craft-based objects, and this is where I began to become very interested in where these fit into the idea of an aesthetics of everyday life. What could we do to understand everyday life for families who operate where home is here as much as it is the idea of home and an imagined and also real place someplace else. And there's this split that goes on back and forth. So the things that art history faculty said to me were things like, oh dear, I don't know why. Sorry, I'm going to pause for just a second. Lisa, it seems to have changed all my backgrounds to black.
Go to the next slide. Do you see a difference in that one? No.
I can just tell the story on this one, but I'm concerned about Sorry about that, y'all.
apologize. We didn't run through this I can just tell. I'll start telling stories while you do that. So basically, I had a professor tell me that studying post-colonialism was jumping on the latest theory trend and fad, and that I should be concerned about that, about jumping on a post-colonialism trend. I also had another professor say to me that we were going to be hiring an Indian art historian, and wasn't that going to be really great for me? And I thought, I'm an Americanist. No, that doesn't help me at all. I had another professor say, okay,
We'll punt. I had another professor, thank you, Alyssa. I had another professor say to me that, sorry, I'm going to put the view back on here real quick.
You can do it from below.
There we go. Cool. I had another professor say, hi Carmen, how are you? I'm not Evelyn Carmen Ramos. I would like to be. She's marvelous. She's a brilliant curator, but I'm not Evelyn, nor is she me. I also had a professor, so what I ended up doing is I petitioned, in order to do my project, producing a place like home, I needed to know Bengali and Hindi. I don't know Bengali or Hindi. I know English. That's all I know. I very marginal French, and I was forced by the department to study German to high pass the exam. They said not only do you need to high pass the examination, the German examination, but you also need to study Hindi or Bengali, and we're really concerned you don't know what art history really is about. So after you finish your exams, you need to take another medieval and a Renaissance class. And I say goodbye. No thank you. That's my background and it's a lot longer, how I ended up doing what I'm doing. But at that time in 1993, this is very much about post-colonialism and trying to get post-colonialism discussed in art history. And now we have another way of talking about it, which is unsettling coloniality and decolonizing. And for me, this is very much understanding that as much as I would like to consider Frantz Fanon's idea of tabula rasa, I just don't think it's possible. The structures and systems are too embedded. So we have to figure out ways to work that are going to deal with the conditions that we live in now. And the reason these conditions are so important to understand is because the demographics in the United States are changing. Now, what I don't like about this slide is that it positions it as white people becoming a minority, and I think that sets up a fear and a risk of alienation. I think instead, I'd like to think of it as we have this opportunity to do better and to recognize that in this demographic shift, we will need to shift and change how we talk about craft history and theory as well. And we have the opportunity to learn from the new students who are going to be coming into our classrooms over the next several decades. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the Warren Wilson program. And this is, as you've heard, is the first low residency master's program. And it falls in sort of a constellation of programs like the one that's happening here at Bard College, Yale University, Winterthur, the RCA. There's a number of places where craft history theory and decorative arts history and theory have been taught. This is another one to add to sort of this marvelous kind of growth that we're seeing of scholarship and interest in critical craft discourse. So there are four basic things that are guiding everything, and these are my touchstone questions and for everything that I do with this program. It's to say yes and. If you come to me and you want to study something, I will say yes, and let's figure out how to make that work and how to make it happen for you. If we don't make space, we're not going to be able to engage new conversations and expand this craftscape. What are good questions? How do you ask questions? How do you ask questions that open things up? How do you ask questions that get people to talk? What are better questions? How do you listen to questions? And which craft are you talking about? I don't care if it's art, craft, or design. I'm just going to put that out there right now. I want to know which kind of craft do you want to study and talk about. This is how I feel a lot of the time.
I feel right now like we know what an airplane looks like, but we're trying to design a new kind of an airplane, and we're trying to build it and fly it and land it all at the same time. Because I feel an enormous amount of pressure to put into action these ideas about unsettling coloniality. And I'm going to make mistakes, and I'm not going to get it right. And there are going to be semesters where I'm going to look back and go, oh, I should have asked that person instead of this person, or moved this person over here, but I'm willing to try. And with that, this is the craziness of what goes on in my head. This is the schedule for a 2-week residency. I'm really glad you're all sitting down. I will tell you, even though it doesn't look like this because I'm not a designer, my inspiration was looking a lot at Bauhaus curriculum and the way they map things out. And thinking about how things overlap and build together. And a lot of it was thinking about the kind of programming that I did at the museum when I was at the Museum of Contemporary Craft in Portland, where we were thinking about different kinds of ways people want to learn and need to learn, different kinds of pacing, different rhythms of how the day goes, and putting things together in a way that is respectful to the instructors so that they can breathe and participate as much as it is for the students to have different moments that are physically active as well as moments that are about listening. So I'm happy to make this make more sense if anyone wants more information. But basically the program it has 4 tracks: history and theory that go through 4 semesters, research methods lab, which also is 4 semesters, materials lab, practicum project, and then it ends with a 5th residency with a colloquium at Warren Wilson College in collaboration with the Center for Craft. What we work on is semester by semester, there are sort of focal points. The first one is really an introduction to the histories and theories, learning how to do oral histories and interviews, as much as getting back into the archive. But understanding that an archive can be anything from what we've been trained as art historians to go to, as much as an artist handing you a brown paper bag and saying, these are my files. This is what I have about my work. How do you engage that? And how do you research when there is no formal archive and you don't know where to go? So really diving into those questions. Second semester will focus on craft in public spaces. Exhibitions, galleries, white cubes, the marketplace, the art fair, that bridge between Laredo and Nouveau Laredo, where people are selling craft work and merchandise for tourists as they go back and forth. All of the kinds of public spaces that people encounter craft. The third semester is craft and communication. Reading books is certainly part of it, but it also you need to understand how podcasts and blogs and Instagram and other forms play into this. The fourth semester is craft and education, and this is where we flip things around to where we're actually listening as much as we're sharing and telling, and this is where the students will be sharing what they know. And there's so many times we all like to say, we learn so much from our students. I really want to put that in action where we actually are learning from our students and seeing what they're thinking about craft and whether we're building something where craft needs to be flexible and shift and change. So again, we'd love to see your coat here in 2020 in July, and we will be sharing information about that. Who are the students? The students are coming from all over the country. Our students right now are all makers, have a making background. 3 of them have MFA degrees. One of them is the chair of the Craft Studies program at Columbus College of Art and Design. These are artists who are coming back because they didn't get critical history and theory in their studio programs, and they want to be able to do this work. 2 of them are employees at Warren Wilson, and that's the way we're going to take what we're learning and tie it back into the undergraduate curriculum so that we're thinking about future at the same time. So they come from all over the country, and the reason that I'm so excited about this, and I hope that this will eventually be international, is because craft happens everywhere. Craft doesn't happen just in the primary centers where we have marketplace situations or craft fairs or art fairs and things like that. Craft is everywhere. So what we're trying to do is to teach the students that the examination of craft and craft histories is something that can happen in lots of different environments. So the students spent 2 semesters on the Warren Wilson campus, and 2 of the semester residencies are at
at the Center for Craft and in downtown Asheville, so they're getting very different kinds of experiences. It's really about a laboratory where we're connecting the local with the global and using the residency experience with our core faculty members and our visiting faculty members and the field trips that we do as a way of taking the laboratory of Swannanoa and the Asheville area and helping them understand how to take that out to Lander, Wyoming, to Detroit, to Winston-Salem, to California. How do you take what you're learning and then study the place where your feet hit the ground? That's what we're trying to teach them. So they understand they don't have to come to the major centers to study what they're doing. They can still hold their jobs at art centers and things like that and apply this in those contexts as well. This is the core faculty for this first year. Ben Lignell is a writer and an artist, a jeweler, and used to be the editor of Art Jewelry Forum. Linda Sandino teaches in the UK. She's worked for the V&A for a long time and is doing a series of, has done a lot of work on research interviews and oral histories. And then I'm one of the core faculty as well. I need 2 more. Hint, hint. And I'm hoping to get people who are outside of the field of art history. We also brought in people who are outside of craft. Lisa Jarrett is someone I know from working with her and in Portland. And Lisa's medium is questions. She knows how to work people through a really tough Rushdie essay and help them with that and a series of exercises and help them get to these very, very big questions. Now, I borrowed this from the art arena because when artists get together, for example, at the Applied Craft and Design program in Portland at the Oregon College of Art and Craft and Pacific Northwest College of Art, the design build is the project that brings the students together, gets them collectively working together, understanding where their strengths are, where they have other questions for each other right at the beginning. We don't do that with art history. We don't do that. And so I thought, what could we do to give them a chance to understand how to step out of their own subjectivities and be able to ask questions? And Lisa came in and worked with them through a whole series of exercises that ended with writing down a durational project, really for Lisa, because she sat and wrote down 100 questions that the students had. And these questions stayed up on the board, on the wall in the dorm, and we kept coming back to them again and again and again. And it led to a real understanding of for the students, of what questions can be, how we open it up, how we bring it back. We kept saying at the end of that day, ask your question in Croft, because Linda Sandino is from the UK, so we always have to say it like Linda, in Croft. So this is the kind of work that opened up the space to then help them learn how to listen and take this material into interviewing strategies, to spread it, to go from asking to listening. And I will tell you that the BARD oral interview projects and the work that's happening at BARD College was very much an inspiration for sending the students out in pairs to do interviews in different kinds of contexts. And you will see from that list that it is a very broad definition or a broad categorization of things that fall under the category of craft. Because I think we forget in the craft world, as much as people of color and marginalized groups seem to be forgotten in a lot of times, we also forget the guilds and these large organizations like the Surface Design Association and places where there is so much learning and so much craft history that is happening through the teaching, through the making and teaching by artists who are out there who are not necessarily at a certain place that we keep coming back to them and again, but they've had a huge amount of impact. I mean, it raises the question on where craft knowledge actually lives. And it lives very, very largely in the mind of Catherine Ellis and through her hands. And she is a great example of somebody who I think is deeply embedded as an educator and in different craft-based organizations, but she's somebody who really merits a lot more focus than perhaps we have been teaching our students, or I feel that I see coming up again and again in different kinds of craft discourse. The
students shared and workshopped their interviews with a lot of critical notes so that we could discuss what worked, what didn't, how to do better next time. How many of you had anything other than turning in an art history paper, get a few comments, and then you get your grade? Yeah. You had some discussion of your paper with someone?
Yes, but also like a hands-on project.
A hands-on project,
Yeah.
okay. But typically, nobody raised their hand other than you. So, most people, you do this handoff, right? You hand off your work, you get it back, you're done with your art history. I think that if we're going to change craft, we need to start taking the discussions that we have in the hallways of conferences like this and actually figuring out how to make that happen better through our critique. We also have incorporated a number of different approaches to history and theory. So Melanie Wilder gave a history of the fiber crew at Warren Wilson. Jenny Sorkin walked the students through critical craft theory, post-colonialism, feminist theory, queer theory, and Glenn did a couple of days of sessions with them about the tension between art and craft and some sort of standard kind of canonical readings from the craft reader and work. So they had a number of different ways of thinking about it, but also thinking about the way that making is a way to understand craft history. And I think that the important thing we need to understand is that there is a kind of knowledge that has come from our craft teachers, from the teachers in academia and outside of academia who have been keeping craft histories alive. Our history's late to the game. And we need to acknowledge the makers, and we also need to acknowledge people like the students, like Celeste, who is an undergraduate at Warren Wilson, who has knowledge that she shared with the students about how she learned blacksmithing, walked through the process with the students, and it became a really wonderful sort of going back and going forward sort of pedagogical way of thinking about it. And I'd like to see these kinds of models tested in other places. We looked at a number of different kinds of spaces. The Southern Highland Craft Guild Fair, Center for Craft, and the Koala Art Center in Cherokee. Which craft are you working on? Which kind of craft are you studying? And knowing which land you are standing on is extremely important. And we started out right in the beginning with our students examining Cherokee basket making and going out to Oconaluftee Village and thinking about the Cherokee as part of the conversation of craft history right from the beginning. One of the things that worked really well, and I really appreciated some of the presentations from this morning and the way that they talked about stacked experiences, and that's really what we did with the Oconaluftee Village and Koala. Faye and Louise taught the students how to make baskets one afternoon. Ezra Shales very graciously was willing to come and put himself in a position of speaking about Cherokee baskets. He's written about baskets recently, but not about these baskets. And he put himself in the position of teaching the students how you approach material that is new and that you're trying to figure out how to do it with the utmost care and sensitivity. And then after we did all of these different experiences, he came back and presented a really marvelous sort of wrapping up and discussion with them. At Oconaluftee Village, we were able to speak with a number of artists who are doing this. It's very much a historical recreation model, but we were also able to go back all the way, because of the Warren Wilson campus, to raise the question of where we begin our craft studies, where we begin the conversation. And this again ties in very much with some of the presentations from this morning. This is river cane. River cane is now an endangered species in North Carolina. And in order to get river cane, Cherokee who work with river cane have to drive to Kentucky, harvest it, and bring it back. But we have a small grove, we have a small area on the campus that has been made available whenever anyone needs it. This is Dave Ellum, who is our Dean of Land. And Dave spent a great deal of time speaking with the students about non-timber forestry products, thinking about bloodroot and golden seal and river cane and where it comes from and how the forest functions as a crafted environment. Heather Harvey talked to them about her film work, her documentaries. What happens when you read all this theory and then you go meet this really lovely human being who doesn't match this theory that you've been reading? and this critical discourse. How do you deal with that? In addition to the visiting faculty, we also have, and core faculty, we have a large number of mentors, and I have to say, there are several people here that I hope to bring involved and get involved in this as more of a conversation. And I think of this less as you coming into our program, than I think of it as how can we connect what you all are doing with what everyone is doing and create more of a constellation. The main thing and the main point that I'm trying to make with bringing up the Cherokee and how we brought Cherokee basket making and traditions in is because where what I was wanting to study was about insertion and recovery and saving something. These are the kinds of things we talk about with craft all the time. It's about understanding the privilege we have, and I have an incredible amount of privilege. I've been lucky to go to 5 continents in the last 4 years, hundreds of cities, spoken with hundreds of different artists and curators and scholars. I need to share all of that. This gives me a place to do it. It also gives me a place to recognize that I need to build a program, and I'm saying I because, as I said, we're still getting going on this. I want a program where it's not about insertion. Empire of Cotton was the book that we started the students off with because I wanted them to understand the root of the capitalism and industrialization and colonialism that dominates cotton and dominates the material aspect of craft. All too often, okay, this slide isn't going to work, so work with me here. William Morris is at the front here, right? So I have a number of syllabi from a lot of different institutions that are teaching history of craft. And they put William Morris as the beginning, right? William Morris is the beginning of craft, right? So in this slide, imagine that William Morris is in the middle, because guess what? Craft is long. William Morris is not the beginning of craft. Craft existed before William Morris, and it's going to exist after William Morris. So where we place William Morris says a lot about what kind of canonical structure you are forcing your students, and that I feel I was forced to look at. And I want to disrupt this. I want to change this. So in this last slide, in black ink, there are images of what I did is I took Glenn's craft reader and I pulled all the essays that dealt with the 1930s. And if you start craft history, contemporary, or rather let's say modern, because I don't think it's contemporary, but ties into contemporary craft history. And if you start with the 1930s and you have them read the Bauhaus Manifesto, Soyetsu Yanagi's Unknown Craftsman, and the essay on Kabi cloth, what do you introduce? You introduce the hand versus the machine, the diaspora of ideas and the circulation of these ideas that came from the Bauhaus. It introduces things going off in a global way. You introduce the idea of nationalism, and you introduce the way that craft is part of revolution. These are the questions and these are the kind of issues that students who are in art schools are studying through craft. It gives a direct line to be able to talk about that. William Morris is important, and I want to make sure that people understand. I'm not saying don't teach William Morris, but can we kind of fade it out a little bit? kind of mix it in a little, maybe acknowledge the textile patterns he appropriated from India and other places. Thinking about utilizing a colonial lens means accepting that there is violence that needs to be addressed. And I think Lisa touched on that quite beautifully in her paper. And this is intrinsic to process. Priya Kanchandani wrote recently about the India Pavilion at the London Design Biennale, which she curated. And she wrote about indigo. And she said, this is a natural color created from the indigofera plant, which has become synonymous with this rare pigment was used to dye fabric, repel insects, treat ailments, disinfect, ward off spirits, and even to decorate an entire city. But it also became inextricably linked with the colonial trade and slavery. It was once said that no indigo box was dispatched to England without a smear of blood. The use of indigo has hence become a symbol of India's emotional plight, representing a process of catharsis for a nation
whose invisible histories are being unraveled. The reason I mention this is I worked with a really marvelous student, Bukola Koiki, who worked with Indigo in the Applied Craft and Design program. And because she was working with Indigo, repeatedly had to explain to people that no, she was not jumping on a trend. Indigo is trendy. She's Nigerian. Long history there that people don't know. These are the craft histories that are part of what need to be rethought in our writing and our teaching. It's okay to be uncomfortable. It really is. It's okay to ask hard questions. We started out, and these are some of the techniques that we all are learning in different other kinds of environments. We started out with, if you used a word that somebody didn't understand, you've got to do this. So when teleological was said, everybody's hand went up, right? We also said this. I'm going to ask a question that I think is stupid, or that may be seen as racist, or I'm just really uncomfortable asking. And I'm going to do this. It happened just a few times where people said, I need to ask this. If we can create an environment where we're okay asking these tough questions, we can unsettle this coloniality. We can create an environment that's actually about shared discussion and conversation. I'm going to breeze through these, and basically these touch on some of the other kinds of experiences, and I brought these in, and I think they tie in beautifully with some of what Bernard talked about. We did a dinner, an actual farm-to-table dinner, not like what's advertised in Portlandia. This was in the garden shed at Warren Wilson College, and Ben Lignell and Jacob Rault cooked the entire meal. 90% of this meal was made with vegetables and meat from the Warren Wilson farm. The flowers were from the local garden and the garden of Heather Harvey, one of the faculty. And East Fork Pottery lent us 32 place settings of their ceramics, which gave us a chance to talk to the students about the materiality of what they were eating, how it was prepared, the craft of the kitchen, the craft of making a meal to share, and how do we address history and theory when our experiences of craft in an everyday situation are things like these kinds of meals? And how do we theorize this? How do we understand it? How do we step back and examine the factory that produced these ceramics as part of the conversation, as much as the retail spaces in which this particular body of ceramics work is being sold. We visited different archives. We visited the Archive of Western North Carolina, and we visited the Southern Highland Craft Guild, and we also used the Warren Wilson Archive. So we gave the students a chance to understand your archivist is your best friend. And you need to figure out who is the keeper of knowledge and get to know them. But you also need to understand other kinds of bodies of archives and knowledge too. Sarah Seastream is an artist who's based in Portland, Oregon. Sarah is building an archive of indigenous knowledge. And this is an archive that if any of you are indigenous to this land that we are standing on, you have access to her knowledge. If not, you have access to the finished material, finished object, the basket, whatever is made from these materials. So thinking about who gets to keep knowledge and why becomes a part of this conversation. How do we understand folk craft, artisanal craft, tourist craft? How do we understand other biennials besides the Venice Biennale and Documenta? There are biennials that have happened in South Korea for a long, long time, European ceramics context. How do we bring in craft and immigrant stories? This is embroidery by my grandmother, and that's us eating at that dining table at Thanksgiving. And these are my absolutely beautiful movie star looking grandparents. How do we understand that Anonymous was not the same woman in every location? The anonymous women who made the museum and are pictured here, we can find out who they are. You know, their descendants live in the Portland area. We know Maytha Ganguly's great-grandmother made that bag. How many people have collected these and for their sake of their being beautiful without thinking about the fact that this kind of beaded work
was something that a young girl did with her mother and her aunts and the women in her village. And when she left, she would leave with a dowry box and those embroideries on her lap and go to her future husband's home, right? She may not have ever seen those women again, ever. In fact, Maeva's great-grandmother was told, if they beat you, better you throw yourself in the well because you cannot come home. So these embroideries that we see in import-export stores and that we collect in different places, they have a very fraught history and they are tied into anonymous women's labor that needs to be recognized. Is it easy? No. This is a really difficult process, and I'm struggling with certain aspects of it, and I hope to speak to some of you about these problems as we go forward. But I think it's also important to understand that we're taking a lot of steps to decolonize and to unsettle coloniality, and I think just to add to the wonderful introduction that Lisa gave for Aram, Aram's recent exhibition is called We Are Never, Never Other. And when I first saw that, it reminded me that this other and centric kind of this model that we have put in place needs to be disrupted. And Aram is doing, and the way in which she did it is a way of reminding us that we may be other here, but we're not other someplace else. And that I'm trying to figure out how to bring that better into the conversation. So Unsettling Coloniality is available online on the Critical Craft Forum website. And if you want information about the program, you can follow us on Instagram. And with that, I'm going to conclude with the questions that we wanted to throw out for open discussion. And what I'm going to do is to get online and in a Google document what you all are bringing up, and we love very much for you to share what you're thinking. So thank you very much.
So Lisa's going to join me back up here, and we will throw it open for questions. All right.
And I think we have microphones, right? Great. Great. So we're going to stand here, and I know that's been us sitting over here, or maybe it's less formal, I don't know.
But we'd love to hear your questions or your thoughts, your concerns, your challenges on working through some of these questions.
Can you just explain a little bit more about coloniality? What exactly does that mean in terms, how is it different than colonialist?
Coloniality refers to the ongoing structures and systems of thought that have remained from colonization, because I think it seeks to disrupt post-colonial studies, because 10 years later a lot of people were saying, well, colonialism still exists, so it's called coloniality, to acknowledge that a lot of those structures and ways of thinking are still with us.
It's also, I think, a way of pointing out, with post-colonialism, there seems to be this, and other people may feel differently, but there seems to be this attitude that certain people are the ones who keep talking about post-colonialism. We are all in a post-colonial situation. We are actually all in a simultaneously colonial and post-colonial situation. So it's a way of trying to play around with bringing that out into view.
It's like a strategy of unmasking.
Hi, over here. Hi, guys. It's Lynn Heller from OCAD University. And I just want to note a process that's been going on at OCAD for the last few years, a decolonizing process. And it's been quite wonderful in many ways. We've had all kinds of workshops around understanding specifically Indigenous culture, and really going through our curriculum, trying to understand what we're teaching, what we're missing, that sort of thing. But I'll bring up one of the trickier questions and throw it out there. And that is that there's a real sense of no teaching without us, or this idea that certain people should be teaching certain histories. And that's really stymied me because I teach a cross-cultural issues and craft course, for example, and I also teach history of textiles. And as Lisa, really, you went through a lot of that history that obviously was typically overlooked, but I would suggest is actually more and more part of our curriculum. A lot of what you were talking about certainly rang true in terms of what we're trying to teach. But I think a lot of us are really struggling with this idea of can we teach this history or can't we? I guess it's that simple.
So I feel like this is part of the challenges of these conference formats, is that somebody out here has a thought about this, and it's very challenging to kind of get the conversation going. So before we respond, I'm going to throw out to anyone else. Is anyone else dealing with the same question? Can you raise your hands, just so we see? Okay, so this is something several people are dealing with. Do any of you who have dealt with it or are dealing with it have a thought about how it's working or not in teaching craft or connecting to craft histories where you are?
I'm working in early 19th century American. I'm an art historian. Sorry. And I'm working in the intersection of art science and education. And what I find, one of the things that actually brought me here to this particular session was it's becoming unbelievably apparent to me that for instance, in the early 19th century, we didn't have these silos, we didn't have these codified academic disciplines. And in fact, culturally speaking, there was a great deal of openness. But the way that 20th century art historians or scientists, or even in a number of different disciplines, we tend to wear these blinders. We tend to see everything as if, we impose this 20th century mindset looking back. So we take that siloed sort of attitude that sort of seeps into our DNA because it's the time we live in. And we then start getting a certain arrogance about how much smarter we are and how much better we are at understanding. And this was very naive, and this was romantic, and this was blah, blah, blah. And in the meantime, missing utterly and completely the open discourse that was actually going on in the early 19th century without those walls. And I see people missing that all the time. So I wonder, how you, well, yes, okay, so that's my take on it. I mean, I think that the history of craft is dealing with the same thing, but there is the same problem with our mindset that we impose when we turn and look back. And I do wonder how aware everyone is to that issue, because oftentimes you don't really find that mentioned beyond teleology, beyond Whiggism, and then that's it.
No, I mean, I don't have, responding to your question, Lynn, like, I feel conflicted as well. I don't have all the answers. I think it's important to recognize that there's context where it's less appropriate for particularly myself as a white-skinned person to be teaching those histories, and being really sensitive to that, as well as the fact that there's no one subjectivity that's going to embody every single perspective. And so that's why I think canons are important and citation is important. So the types of readings that are given to students and who has written them, and just very clear that in my case, I talked through being Jewish and having to put together where my family history came from, making my perspective clear, being vulnerable, saying that I don't have all the answers, bringing in guest speakers, and that's just part of it. But I also hope for the time where I am obsolete and there is someone else in my place who can also teach these histories, because I think a lot of the times these questions come up because there isn't adequate inclusion and representation, and people are used to being told their own story by someone else. So sometimes asking students to contribute is really important, like Nita's talking about. And if people have any other suggestions, please share them.
I add to this too briefly that what histories can I talk about? My dad is Bengali, my mom is Maharashtrian, they met in Florida, I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. I've lived in Jersey, I've lived in Texas, I've lived in Chicago, I live in Portland, I work at Warren Wilson College. What history? The Black Power movement is what gave me the chance to do what I do, and it changed the school system that I went to in New Jersey. Is that not part of my history too? You know, it's a really fraught question. You know, and it leads to some of the things about authenticity that have come up in the conference as well. Like, you know, and if I'm only allowed to write on South Asian Americans who are of Bengali and Maharashtrian descent, yeah, I write about my sister. And I'm being flip, but I'm also saying it in a flip way because I think it's a perplexing question, and it's one that I really like the point about. I would agree with Lisa on the point about it's what you choose to share and how you choose to do it that can flip it.
I feel like there's nobody in this room who's not dealing with the idea of who's allowed to teach. I think that's something that we all share. Maybe some are allowed to be more reflexive about it than others, depending on your discipline and what you're teaching. But I think it's something that we're all dealing with. And I also think that teaching is often about silence and opening spaces as opposed to speaking and teaching, and that inviting people in doesn't answer the question of who's allowed to teach what, but it does help to answer the question of who's allowed to speak here. And I think that can be very helpful. Also, the particular, right, which is what you guys are talking about, is like who am I as a particular person, right, as an individual, and those are all things I think can be really helpful thinking about teaching.
Is that fair, what I wrote up there?
Yeah, I should first say that I don't teach craft. I'm not an art historian. I'm actually a lawyer and a professor in law and public policy, and have integrated crafts in all kinds of ways, which I won't get into. But I do want to just say that yes, we all do think about, do I have the right to teach X? Particularly when I was asked in my institution to teach a course on Black masculinities, and if you can see me, I'm neither Black nor masculine. Well, masculine we don't know, but but our institutional pedagogy, and this is kind of my point, is that I think we need to rethink pedagogy. It's not about the sage on the stage, but if we think about pedagogy as facilitating learning, and in the process of facilitating learning, collaborating with our students and creating curricula, or developing our curricula in a way where there's an opportunity for students to add in material or to suggest, and I think you've talked about this really brilliantly about asking what are the questions people have up front. We don't have to do that just in a master's program. We can do that in an undergraduate program or in any teaching environment that you're in. So I think it's really to go back to the original issue, in the way that I personally have dealt with is really by thinking of myself as a facilitator of learning. And as far as I know, I'm not black, and, you know, masculine is God knows what, but, you know, but what I can do is I can open the door and say, okay, this is what I do know, and this is, and I can help you do the research, I can help you learn how to ask the questions. So I think we need to reframe how we think about pedagogy.
I just wanted to bring up the logistical aspects to this. There just aren't that many people of color who are in the field. I mean, I remember there was a joke, I come from mostly museums, I'm a sort of, you know, I've been a museum curator, a director, a recovering curator, now I'm sort of doing a little teaching. And I remember a time when there were like, if it wasn't like an ethnically specific museum in this country, there were 4 black people in major white museums. And then when Thelma Golden and I went to the studio, got back to 2. So I'm thrilled now that you can have 20, I know at least 25 young African Americans who are sort of like curators now. And I think it's similar to the question that we've dealt with in terms of what artists have rights to do in terms of imagery. Does Dana Schultz have the right to sort of do a picture of Emmett Till? In the same exhibition where there was no problem with Henry Taylor doing one at Philandro Castile. What made the difference there? And really it's all about who has opportunity, who has access to publicity, and it's changing, but it's still, you know, like, but really there's still many challenges. So I think that what different people have said in the room is absolutely true, but I think that you can't do too much for kinds of people to do it. I mean, I've had like this really bizarre, you know, career where I thought of myself as sort of a champion of people of color, but ended up doing a lot of work on overlooked white male artists. And so, you know, so I mean, you know, my whole take on what diversity means is really about opportunity. So I think that that's really one of the questions we have. And whether or not people of certain communities, I'll just call them, you know, looked at our field as a viable way to make a living. You know, for a long time, the average middle-class African-American whose parents in the 80s were spending $100,000 a year or in total on a degree, we're not going to start a job in a museum where the starting thing was $24,500, where your starting salary is $24,500. And I remember Thelma Golden actually bought her father to meet me when she wanted to become a curator, because he could see there was an African-American woman she was okay, she wasn't in the street, she wasn't working 10 jobs, and she could be a curator. So it's really about what people see is available to them, and it's changing a lot. And it's changing a lot because of all the discourse that we're having, such as we're having today. But it's still, there are a lot of changes. So don't be so tough on yourselves. And I think that we just have to be realistic about it and just sort of make the field attractive to people.
So Larry, thank you. And if I could have taken my parents to meet you, it would have made them a lot more comfortable. Because it took me until the end of my sophomore year to tell them I was going to be an art history major. I thought they were going to cut me off because I was supposed to be a doctor. You know, classic, you know. And I wished I had somebody to take them to. We went to museums all the time, but that was something we went to. You didn't have a job there. But I wanna just respond with 2 brief things. One is that I think I'm gonna admit right now that I'm impatient, and part of it is because I met you at the NAEA conference in the early 90s in education, right? And you and Bas Prabhu and Kim Kanatani sat with me and mentored me back then. This is 30 years ago, right? I received a Smithsonian Fellowship for Museum Leadership, and Faith and I were talking about this yesterday, in 1992. After the year we did this, of the 15 people of color who had this fellowship, 4 were still in the field, and I wasn't one of them. I left museum work to go to grad school. So these pipeline issues, yes, it's changing, yes, it's shifting, but you know, it's really freaking slow. And Yeah, so that's just a response to that. But then also the question is, the difference between what I was doing as a curator and what happens in museums in terms of craft and people of color versus switching gears to teaching and trying to develop a way to teach craft histories and craft theories. If we flip it and open up the field, then there were 2 African American potters at the Southern Highland Craft Guild. I don't think either of them have had anything written about them. So you open it up, and if the students, I'm trying to think, if we open it up this way, and it's not just about what we're doing and what we've been trained to do in the museum field, and how can we open up the field to include more voices, right?
Because you wanted me to share, so I'm going to share.
I know, I asked you.
So what I would sort of say to that is that sometimes you have to ask the right questions on how to sort of, include people in these histories. Now, when you emailed me about your compendium you're doing on craft, and you said to me you wanted me to do something on African American craftspeople. So I said, okay, cool, I can sort of do. And then I thought about it, and I emailed you back and I said, Namita, there's no way I can pretend that for African Americans, craft was this post-war, anti-technological, anti-industrial, phenomenon to sort of find themselves, their integral selves. I have to go back to slavery, because all the crafts, a lot of the crafts that was done in this country were done by slaves. And so we took care of that. And then I found myself in this other question. What do I do somewhere between Harriet Powers and maybe Lois Mailloux Jones and Anne Russell Jones in the 20s doing some kind of design crafts thing? What happened in between? So then I turned to my friend Deborah Ambush and found out that she was doing interesting work on curricula in historically Black colleges as they were coming up in the age of Reconstruction. And we're looking at these curricula and realizing that the curriculums were not liberal arts humanities curricula. The curricula were putting former slaves into nice Victorian outfits and teaching them skills to make them be maids and janitors and things with a degree, So it was all about applied, domestic. And then when you sort of take that question out, what kinds of teaching were being done? But if you don't ask the right question, if you don't sort of like really think about what the situation of a particular group is, if you're going to do this history, then you can't do it. It's like, I was very interested in the Sami because I had a brief brush with the Sami when I was in Oslo. And I was just really fascinated by, Jeremy's, presentation, because, all of a sudden, I have to fall upon this exhibition, and now I have a sense of who these people are, who the person on our tour in Oslo couldn't even identify. We saw a sign and she said, oh yes, the Sami, they're my sister and I went, indigenous people? So, I think it's really asking the right question, thinking about what his history is, as everybody's talking about. The textile is not just something that exists as when you put it on the shelf. The textile exists with this long history. Yeah. And now I'm not going to share anymore.
Okay, well, I don't really, it's hard to follow you, but I just wasn't to. Well, I started thinking about your opening up of things in relation to, at every level, really. And since you have a sort of 2-week intensive, it made me start thinking about just what we would call distance learning in Britain anyway, and some very successful programs, but particularly in terms of access, because the people that came on those were quite different. And I have to say, after 20 years at the Bard Graduate Centre, I had never taught fewer working class people. There's only a glowing picture of the BGC, but never taught fewer people of colour. And it's very frustrating. I never taught fewer men in the class. It's just very, it seems to me that it would be really interesting to for you to just be constantly thinking, as I'm sure you are, of who has access to your programs, you know, and to keep that as broad and open as possible, because if there is this dialogue of us learning, as we all do from students, and students hopefully learning a bit from us, I think that's really important. Then one other thing I want to do is practice your whatever this is this sign you give your students, because I actually felt quite uncomfortable when people laughed about William Morris, and I mean, I think you should be even further into, you know, earlier histories than even those dots. And I'm not particularly interested in Morris's textiles, but as someone who's an anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist, he's really important to read, and especially bloody good on India. You know, and one of the things we have to do is reread and rethink. And, you know, the political revolutionary Morris is rarely mentioned, and that's one of the sort of works of retrieval that is still going on, of the, you know, the depoliticizing and the politicized Morris is a job I think every generation has to do, and you know, that's only a tiny example.
Yeah.
Time for 2 more questions. One here.
Actually, both comments kind of get at what I was stumbling around trying to talk about. It's because I hear a lot about adding people in, but that, you stated it very clearly, that doesn't work when you talk about the history of craft, and you have to deal with African American history, and you have to go back to slavery. And there are other aspects that even require that we go even further back. And so it seems the question of decolonizing has to somehow get right at academia and decanonizing. How do we decanonize? I mean, that's what I feel I'm banging up against constantly as I try to weave these different disciplines together, because art history frowns on my doing that. And it's like, then I can't talk about what I want to talk about if I don't. So yeah, how do we decanonize?
Yeah, and there's a lot of writing about decolonizing methodologies, and the fact that the very structures, someone brought this point up as well with pedagogy, the very structures within which we are teaching our colonial institutions that are built on the erasure of indigenous and local knowledges. So we need to do a lot of work of reinvention of those structures. And one last thing I want to say is, you know, in fiber we talk a lot sometimes about we need diversity. And the truth is most artists using fiber today are international and non-white. If you look, you know, and they're getting more and more attention in the art world, which is important, but it's the institutions that are largely 80 to 90% white, and it's the canon that is largely 80 to 90% white. So yes, your point is very well taken, that's so important, but it's also a matter of, you know, opening pipelines and shifting the discourse so that people see themselves reflected. And also education in this country is just frightfully expensive. So I think a paradigm shift is in order.
I just want to say that my work on the first syllabus in history text in 1973, I could not have done it without Oscar Triggs, Pevsner, and William Morris. It would have been impossible to develop. And we developed the post-World War II with phone calls, trading slides back and forth all over the country, and there was no faxes, there was no email, and it was really difficult. I'm also curious why you were the only person of color in your slides. That really bothered me. In the slides that you showed of all the different parties and the getting together, you were the only person of color. And I would like to say that 3 weeks ago I was at a conference and I was the minority because I was the only 3 of us were heterosexual and middle-aged.
So Helen, that's because most of the time I am the only person of color. Well, I don't.
Barbara Londo, Joyce Schwartz, there are lots of people here tonight.
people of color, Lugo, you mean Roberto Lugo? Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, but actually, Lisa Jarrett is African American, and one of my students is of Filipino origin, but she may not read as Filipino on the image. So this gets to this complexity of the optics of what you see, right? But your point is well taken, and I do think most of the time I find myself to be one. I'm always thrilled when there's more than one, and you know, if you look at curators of craft in the United States, when Larry and I left, Abraham Thomas is now at the Renwick, and forgive me, I can't remember the name of the curator in George Washington Textile Museum. Thank you, Camille and Brewer. So basically, we replaced an African American with an African American and a South Asian with a person of South Asian origin with another person of South Asian origin, but there are no more people of color who have been given any curatorial roles in our craft institutions in the United States. So it's a problem, but that may be a factor, and I appreciate you saying it because I was not as sensitive then in thinking about what images I put up, but there are more and more people of color involved in the program besides me and Lisa and my students. So, but thank you.
I'm gonna miss that.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, just some brief concluding remarks here. One of the themes that has revealed itself over the course of the last 3 days is the pronounced intertwining of theory and practice in craft studies. And I think our two panels today highlighted this once again. I'd like to thank today's speakers for sharing the research behind their innovative projects designed to transform visitor experience, curatorial narratives, undergraduate and graduate learning, and the blind spots of academic histories of craft. You all left us with not only new perspectives on the intellectual, ethical, and pedagogical responsibilities of the field moving forward, but also, crucially, a set of tools for making change and inspiring new approaches. As we wrap up, I'd like to thank once again the Windgate Foundation for their support of the symposium, our working group and speakers, and all three institutions and their teams behind the symposium, Museum of Arts and Design, Bard Graduate Center, and the Center for Craft. And last but not least to you, the attendees, thank you very much for being here. Please look out for the post-event evaluation that will be in your email inboxes on Monday. Your feedback is very important to us, so we're really looking forward to hearing from you. And now, finally, I'd just like to wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you.